Com a palavra, professor.
Thank you very much. I need hardly say that it is a great pleasure to receive this high honor, particularly from the outstanding Department of Linguistics at this great university. I had the very welcome opportunity to visit the department almost 25 years ago at the invitation of my friend and colleague, the late Lucia Lobato, and to give a few talks that were something of a turning point for me. The talks reviewed recent and current work, but then went on to offer some speculations about what might lie on the horizon in the study of language and mind. The speculation seemed extreme at the time, if not outlandish, as many international commentators felt. But pursuing them turned out to be very fruitful, not just for me, but for many linguists who joined in these efforts. That included a growing number of Brazilian linguists who went on to make very valuable contributions to ongoing research. Professor Lobato's department here has had a large role in the impressive development of Brazilian linguistics in recent years, becoming a significant component of a flourishing discipline worldwide. Actually, Brazil is particularly well placed to lead the way in such studies with its established cultural institutions and its unparalleled resources of indigenous communities, each with its rich contribution of linguistic variety and cultural wealth, now unfortunately severely threatened, even at risk of survival. Well, it is tempting to proceed to discuss some of the surprising results that have been established in recent years, and once again to speculate on what might lie ahead. What might lie ahead, that is, if the conditions for productive inquiry are sustained. Regrettably, we are at a moment of history in which these prospects are not secure in much of the world. Those endangered societies include the Colossus of the North, as the United States has long been called. They also include the Colossus of the South. It's the term that was used a century ago to refer to Brazil in the light of its enormous human and material resources and the prospects for its cultural and material development. There are, however, serious impediments to moving forward to a more civilized world, and with it, a flourishing educational and research environment, the two, of course, closely interlinked. The scale of contemporary disorders is reflected in an important report that was just released by the prestigious Social Progress Imperative, their 2020 review of social justice and welfare during the past decade in 163 countries. The report finds that there has been slow and uneven progress everywhere, with 3 startling exceptions, which have declined the United States, Brazil, and Hungary, the last now suffering under the autocratic rule of Viktor Orban. These studies were carried out before the pandemic struck. The impact of the pandemic provides its own evidence about the outliers in international society. In ranking of number of cases and deaths from COVID-19, the top three are the United States, Brazil, and India, far above all others. For the United States and Brazil, well beyond their proportion of the global population. The United States has 4% of the world's population, over 25% of cases. For Brazil, the figures are similar. The pre-pandemic index, social progress index, shows that the United States has dropped from 19th place in the world a decade ago to 28th place today. That's despite its enormous wealth and power and unique advantages. Brazil has dropped to 61st place. The United States is now ranked lower than much poorer countries, such as Estonia and Greece. The more specific measures are highly informative. The United States is well in the lead internationally in medical technology, but it is ranked 97th in access to quality health care, with health statistics similar to Albania, Jordan, and Chile. The figures for education are particularly relevant to our immediate concerns here. The United States ranks first in quality of universities, but 91st in access to quality basic education. For children, access is on a par with Mongolia and Uzbekistan. These figures reflect serious social malaise. There are many factors, but one salient one stands out: the impact of 40 years of neoliberal policies ever since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher proclaimed the new doctrines. Government is the problem, Reagan declared in his inaugural address 40 years ago. Decisions must be shifted away from governments, which are partly under public influence, to private power that is completely unaccountable to the public. Furthermore, under the doctrines that are being imposed, it is a matter of fundamental principle that private power must have no concern for the public interest. It must be committed solely to self-enrichment. So the leading economist of the movement, Milton Friedman, instructed the world as the neoliberal campaign began. Thatcher added that there is no society, only individuals cast into the market to survive as best they can in a cruel world of increasingly concentrated power. Unwittingly, no doubt, Thatcher was paraphrasing Karl Marx, who condemned the autocratic rulers of his day for turning society into what he called a sack of potatoes, isolated individuals, defenseless against concentrated power. Well, the consequences come as little surprise. Bitterness, anger, resentment, contempt for institutions over much of the world. These quite understandable reactions provide fertile territory for demagogues who can pretend to be your savior while stabbing you in the back, blaming scapegoats for your plight, blacks, immigrants, China, whatever seems appropriate, evoking ancient prejudices. And meanwhile, carefully shielding the powerful forces who are actually responsible and whom the demagogue loyally serves. It's not hard to find examples. It's worth taking a moment to review briefly the economic history of the West since World War II. There have been two clearly distinct periods with a break about 40 years ago. The first is the period of what is called regimented capitalism from the end of the war into the 1970s. The second is the neoliberal period that took off under Reagan and Thatcher, others following. The period of regimented capitalism is called by economists the golden age of capitalism. Growth was unusually high, and it was egalitarian growth. Wages tracked productivity. Financial institutions were limited, tightly controlled. There were no major financial crashes. The neoliberal reaction reversed all of that. Economic growth continued, but more slowly. The wealth that was produced flowed into very few pockets. Wages were decoupled from productivity and flattened. The most authoritative current study from the Rand Corporation estimates the loss of income to the lower 90% of the population to be $47 trillion. That's $1 trillion a year stolen from working people and the middle class. Now, that is in addition to the tens of trillions stolen from the public by pouring capital into tax havens once Reagan authorized these practices in the name of liberty. Previously, they had been banned and the laws were enforced. Financial institutions exploded in scale, becoming the dominant part of the economy, causing regular crises thanks to the predatory practices authorized by deregulation, and followed by taxpayer bailouts for the perpetrators that are in fact only a part of the massive state subsidy they receive. In the United States, which led the liberal onslaught, by today, 0.1% of the population, not 1%, 0.1% have 20% of the wealth. That is twice what they had when Ronald Reagan was elected. A majority of the population survives from paycheck to paycheck, almost no reserves. So-called free markets led to monopolization with reduced competition and innovation as the strong swallowed the weak. Reagan and Thatcher moved at once to destroy labor unions, recognizing that labor unions are the primary means of defense for working people against concentrated capital. In doing so, they were adopting the leading principles of neoliberalism from its early years in interwar Vienna, where the founder and patron saint of the movement, Ludwig von Mises, was overjoyed when the proto-fascist government violently destroyed Austria's vibrant social democracy and the unions that were interfering with what is called sound economics by defending the rights of working people. Von Mises explained in his 1927 neoliberal classic called Neoliberalism. That's 5 years after Mussolini initiated his brutal rule. Quote von Mises, "It cannot be denied that fascism and similar movements aimed at the establishment of dictatorships are full of the best intentions, and that their intervention has for the moment saved European civilization. The merit that fascism has thereby won for itself will live on eternally in history, though it will be only temporary," he assured us. The black shirts will go home after having accomplished their good work. The same principles inspired enthusiastic neoliberal support for the hideous Pinochet dictatorship. A few years later, they were put into operation in a different form in the global arena under the leadership of the United States and the United Kingdom, and they are hardly unfamiliar elsewhere. It's worth remembering the lessons of the history of the past century. One of the most striking and consistent lessons is that neoliberalism, with its cry for liberty, is perfectly compatible with harsh repression and violence by a powerful state. We should bear that in mind as we move into a new post-pandemic era, something that I will return to in a few moments. Educational systems were not spared under the neoliberal reaction, illustrated by the figures I cited earlier for the United States. To repeat, the United States ranks first in quality of universities, but it ranks 91st in general access to quality basic education. For children, access is on a par with Mongolia and Uzbekistan. These numbers are duplicated for healthcare and other domains of the common good. They bring out the essence of the neoliberal assault with glaring quality. U.S. elite universities have managed to resist the neoliberal assault, and they remain the best in the world. The rest of the system has suffered. Mass public education from the 19th century was one of the great contributions of the United States to modern civilization. No longer. Under neoliberal principles, public education is under sharp attack, since government is the problem and there is no society, according to neoliberal doctrine. Government funding for schools has sharply declined, from kindergarten to the great state college system that was established in the 19th century, which was then unique in the world in quality and scale. The Trump administration, Secretary of Education, multimillionaire Betsy DeVos is quite openly committed to replacing public education by private and religious schools. Public education must not only be reduced or even eliminated, it must also be stifled. The progressive, highly successful ideas of great educators from Wilhelm von Humboldt, the great classical liberal humanist who founded the modern research university, Okay, continue. I'll go back a sentence. The progressive and highly successful ideas of great educators from great 18th century thinker Wilhelm von Humboldt, leading figure in classical liberalism, humanist who founded the modern research university. These ideas must be abandoned, along with the contributions of the inheritors of the classical, liberal, and humanist traditions, such outstanding modern figures as John Dewey, Paulo Freire. It's important to suppress the ideas that inspired the creation of this great university, the vision of Darcy Ribeiro and Anicio Teixeira, leading figures in modern culture. We must abandon the goals of intellectual and cultural enrichment, cooperative effort, diversity, inclusiveness, stimulating creative and independent thought. These humanistic ideals and guidelines have been replaced by a business model that imposes discipline, conformity, concern for oneself. This new model was in fact considered by Enlightenment thinkers and classical liberals. They ridiculed it as similar to pouring water into a vessel, and a very leaky one, as all of us have experienced. Under the new neoliberal business model, faculty are replaced by temporary workers, low-paid adjuncts, graduate students, vulnerable, defenseless. Neoliberal governments favor training a pliable, obedient workforce. They prefer to cast aside those parts of the educational system that merely contribute to cultural wealth, that honor the dictate of the Delphic oracle 2,500 years ago, know thyself. We should not waste time trying to explore and unravel the mysteries of human nature, the deep properties that distinguish humans so sharply from the rest of the natural world, not always to its benefit, as we witness with horror right now, but with reserves of creativity, compassion, and talent that can be nourished and marshaled to overcome today's existential crises. The oracle called on us to know thyself, which requires further that we go on to try to understand the social world in which we live and in which we should participate actively as informed and educated citizens. All of this is to be cast aside under the neoliberal model of business rule, self-enrichment for the powerful, struggle for bare survival for the majority, with its immediate corollaries for the educational system. Why, after all, should young people waste their time learning about the history of their own societies and the world, or coming to appreciate and contribute to the rich legacy of the arts and humanities, or to explore the cultural wealth of very different societies? That does not enhance profit for the few, and worse, it might subvert authority, the way Socrates did, by asking too many questions and encouraging independent thought in ancient Athens. His subversive efforts were terminated by the hemlock. Today, we can just excise the offending parts of the educational system. We need not murder Socrates. It's enough to eliminate the philosophy department. In fact, why do young people even have to have a deep understanding of mathematics and the sciences, and to wonder at their remarkable achievements, when they can just memorize tools that can contribute to profit in the market? Now, this is, unfortunately, no caricature. Recently, the Tory government in England urged departments like classics at Oxford to justify their existence in terms of market value. The social and educational critic, Stefan Collini, commented aptly that they want to turn first-class educational institutions into third-class commercial enterprises. The sciences are not immune. The shift from government funding to corporate funding research during the neoliberal years has brought with it more close supervision and focus on short-term applied goals that might be profitable for the funder, but should be kept from others and from the general public. Actually, these doctrines are reaching the level of an enormous humanitarian crisis today, with the race to vaccines and the subordination of government policy to the monopoly pricing rights that are accorded to pharmaceutical corporations under the neoliberal investor rights agreements that masquerade under the slogan of free trade. The shift to corporate funding during the neoliberal years has also brought secrecy to the top research universities for the first time, sometimes to the level of scandals that reach the press. A few years ago, the Wall Street Journal reported a case where a student refused to answer a question on an examination because he was working with another professor under a corporate imposed pledge of secrecy. That happened to be at my own university, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the world's leading research universities. Nothing like that had been imaginable under government funding, including the massive funding of research universities like my own through the funnel of the Pentagon, which was a common device of state support for public affairs, from advanced research to the arts and humanities to the interstate highway system. Corporate funding, by its nature, is very different, as is the business model generally. Actually, I've spent most of my professional life, over 60 years, at MIT. It's provided a front row for the processes that have taken place as the economy shifted from the regimented state capitalism of the golden age to the business-run neoliberal model. I don't want to exaggerate. As I mentioned, the elite universities have been able to resist the neoliberal assault on the integrity and mission of the cultural and scientific institutions, but they have not been totally immune, and as throughout the society, it's been hard work to resist the neoliberal wrecking ball. Those familiar with the main scientific journals have plenty of evidence about this, from regular editorials protesting government interference with scientific work in recent neoliberal years, if not from direct experience. What has taken place in the educational institutions tracks rather closely the shifts in the socioeconomic order. During the Golden Age, the government played a major role in shaping educational policy and the economy, but indirectly. Huge numbers of people who would never have been able to go to college were provided with free tuition and subsidy through the GI Bill of Rights, greatly to their benefit and to the benefit of the country, even though it was racist and sexist, limited to veterans of the segregated armed forces. Funding for colleges and universities was greatly expanded. When I arrived 70 years ago in Cambridge, then at MIT, MIT was an engineering school. Under the impact of the greatly expanded government programs, it changed to a university based on science. Incoming students and faculty, more oriented towards science, wanted a much broader education. New departments appeared in linguistics, my own, philosophy, also my own, psychology, anthropology, music and the arts, the humanities, and social sciences, quite generally. That greatly enriched the general intellectual and cultural environment, and as a result, it also enriched scientific work and exploration and engineering achievement with enhanced creativity and exploration. I happen to be in the research laboratory of electronics many of these years. It shifted from an engineering center to one of the major centers for the development of today's high-tech economy: computers, internet, microelectronics, satellites, the rest of the modern advanced economy. All of this was mostly developed at public institutions, public funding, many years later, handed over to private enterprise for adaptation to the market and profits. That's the system of public subsidy, private profit, that's called capitalism in modern usage. The science-based university of the 1970s was very different from the engineering school 20 years earlier, and it has been able to largely resist the neoliberal counterattack that seeks to convert first-class universities to third-class commercial enterprises, to borrow Collini's phrase about the programs of Tory England. Less privileged sectors have been forced to succumb. with effects of the kind I've mentioned. This is not ancient history. It provides lessons for all of us today within the educational system and in the larger society. We are now in the midst of a raging pandemic. It was avoidable. It can be contained, as has been demonstrated in countries where the government is concerned for its citizens, most clearly in East and Southeast Asia and Oceania, later in most of Europe as well, though there are outliers, notably the United States and Brazil, to their shame. We will sooner or later emerge from the pandemic at terrible, mostly needless cost. A new world will emerge. Its contours are now unclear and sharply contested. Those who have created the social order that underlies current crises and have greatly benefited from it are now working relentlessly to ensure that it is perpetuated and in a harsher form with greater government surveillance and control. And we should remember that for a century, neoliberal doctrine and practice has enthusiastically supported state violence and repression in the name of liberty for the few. That is one possible outcome beginning to take shape before our eyes. Another possible outcome has been spelled out this past weekend in Iceland, where the Prime Minister hosted the first meeting of the Progressive International. This global initiative is based on the highly successful movement led by Bernie Sanders in the United States and its European counterpart, DM25, initiated by Yanis Varoufakis, transnational effort seeking to maintain and improve what is of value in the European Union and to overcome its severe flaws. It includes participants from the Global South, and Brazilians may recall that a few years ago, Brazil was the leading voice of the Global South and perhaps the most respected country in the international arena. That could be again. These two contending forces have very different images of the world that will be forged in the new era. Which one will prevail will have enormous consequences, not least for our corner of the world, culture and educational institutions. The stakes, however, are far larger. It is no exaggeration to say that the outcome will determine the fate of the human experiment on Earth. We have the means to overcome the crises that humanity faces. The means are feasible. They are within reach. But it is not enough to know. It is necessary to act. That is the immediate challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Muito obrigada pelas belas palavras, por esse lindo discurso do professor Noam Chomsky. Agradecemos essa brilhante palestra do homenageado desta noite. Declaramos encerrada esta sessão solene que concedeu o título de doutor honoris causa a Noam Chomsky. Convidamos os que nos acompanham nesta transmissão a conhecerem a vasta e rica programação da Semana Universitária no UNB, que seguirá até o dia 25 de setembro, e desejamos a todos uma excelente noite. Obrigada a todos.